probing interview. "What kind of poison?" I asked. "That, miss, is confidential information." The inspector shifted his bottom, and the sofa legs creaked. "I'll thank you to be discreet about anything we ask here today. There is a villain at large, and we mean to arrest him as soon as possible." "Or her," I said. Inspector Locke's furry eyebrows lifted. "Why do you say that, miss?" "Poison is so conveniently domestic," said Granny Jane, "suitable for use by ladies." "Our delicate constitutions," I said, "are not so fond of blood." "I would far prefer to administer poison than to shoot a gun. One needn't even be present at the time of death." "Who better to administer the poison than she who prepares the food?" said Granny. Inspector Locke tapped a heavy finger on his notebook. "Ladies, this is a very serious crime. You," he pointed a finger at me, "are a witness. Do not obstruct the investigation with fancy." I stifled the temptation to salute and sat up straighter. "Yes, sir." "I'd like to ask you, Miss Morton, to close your eyes for a moment. Tell me what exactly you saw when you entered the dance studio." Closing my eyes was a clever suggestion. The library vanished, and the inspector's hairy face with it. The stool was on its side with its cloth pulled off. The cloth is yellow with a tatted edging, embroidered with peonies. Miss Mary Ann would never let it lie upon the floor. The room looked wrong before I even noticed the body. "Can you describe the position of the body?" "Really, Inspector, she's just a child." "Oh, I'll show you." I dropped to the floor and contorted myself into the same shape in which I'd found Mrs. Eversham. I turned my head and opened my mouth into a silent scream, but closed it at once because the carpet smelled rather dusty. "My word," said Granny Jane. "Indeed," said Inspector Locke. "Children often make the best witnesses. They report what they see instead of making assumptions about what we want them to have seen." "An interesting point," said Granny. "However," she broke off to glare at me. "That's enough, Agatha. Get up." "However," the inspector said it just the way Granny had, "you are finding it difficult to remain silent. I need the girl's impressions with no interference. You can stay with your lip buttoned or depart for a room where your chatter is welcome." No one had not ever spoken to grandmother with such cheek. I held my breath, but it took only 3 seconds for Granny to respond. "I'm quite comfortable here, Inspector, thank you." She made a great show of settling into the cushions, displaying not even a hint of the affront. She was disguising herself as we watched, becoming a fluffy old woman. I could hear in my head what she would say later. "Uppish man needs to trim his mustache." A knock at the door caused Constable Beck to spin briskly around. I rolled onto my tummy and pushed myself up to standing. I heard Charlotte from the hallway asking what she needed. "Shall I take Miss Graves elsewhere, Inspector?" said Constable Beck. "We'd have independent witness statements that way without each other's influence." I imagined Charlotte's blush beginning at her throat and rushing to her temple. He wanted to be alone with her. Inspector Locke dismissed him with a wave of the hand. I watched the door close. If only I could see what happened next. The manly policeman, his brow a bit damp from nerves, turned to the young woman with the dimpled chin. "Oh, Miss Graves," he sighed, his large bony hands cupping her freckled face. "How I've longed for this moment, praying we could be together." I blinked. I had nearly used the word love. "Miss Morton," said Inspector Locke, "can we proceed?" "May we?" murmured Granny Jane. She's correcting his grammar, so quietly that only I could hear. A good thing, as I did not think the inspector would appreciate a grammar lesson. "Think carefully, miss. Was the victim holding anything in her hand?" I shook my head no. "Take your time. Something white, perhaps?" "Nope." I closed my eyes again to improve my recall and my ability to report. Her hands were puffy and a bit gray, really more than blue. The closer one, the right one, was open, palm up, and certainly empty. Rather like a gardening glove left on the path. And the other? The left hand was curled over. I suppose it might have held something, but it would have been very small. I couldn't see properly either time. Either time? You had more than one encounter with the deceased? I left when the doctor came in, I said. But then, spit it out, Miss Morton. We are not chatting for pleasure. I'd forgotten my notebook, I whispered, examining my hands. On the piano? I popped back in to fetch it. The inspector cleared his throat. And when you re-entered the room, can you tell me, did your dancing teacher have anything in her hand? No, I remembered clearly. She was sitting on the piano stool, so she must have set that to right. Moved the piano stool? The inspector scribbled in his book. Well, yes, but I expect she needed it to sit down, didn't she? The words came more easily now. This was quite diverting. She sagged a little, shoulders hunched. Not anything like her usual dancer's posture. She was wringing her hands. I turned my own hands over each other to show what Miss Mary Ann had been doing. They were certainly empty. Nervous, was she? He made another note. Upset, I'd say. Grievously upset. Who wouldn't be? Her sister-in-law was dead at her feet. Indeed she was, said Inspector Locke, quite dead, to someone's great satisfaction. His words sent a chill up my back. Did he already have a suspect? Granny Jane leaned forward and spoke confidently. Surely no one we know, Inspector. In cases of murder, ma'am, the killer is nearly always closely related to the victim. Life would certainly be smoother, Miss Mary Ann had said, if she were not in Torquay. In Rose's words, at least once a day, I find myself wishing that she were dead. So she's thinking back to what those two ladies had said. You can't be thinking, I broke off. I'd had the same ghoulish ideas, but they sounded worse coming from him. What I can or cannot think is up to me, young lady. Your task is merely to give me a picture of the room. Tell me about the tea things. Was she so careless as to move those too? I closed my eyes that were suddenly blurred with tears. Could I tell him anything to prove the innocence of the Eversham ladies? Were they innocent? The puddle on the floor was milky tea, not clear, so it must have come from the cup, not the teapot. The pot. Where was the pot? Had Miss Mary Ann poured the tea in the pantry and carried it out to her visitor? That would suggest she'd prepared the tea in private. Perhaps I should not tell him that. There isn't a tea trolley in the dance studio, I said. It would take up too much room. I don't remember seeing the teapot, but a smashed cup on the floor had tea spilled around it. The floor is wood, of course, for dancing on, so there's no carpet for the tea to soak into. It just sat there in a puddle. I squeezed my eyes tight. Miss Mary Ann's little blue milk jug was sitting on top of the piano. My notebook had lain nearby, and next to it was a sugar bowl. As I noted that, my skin prickled in recognition that something was wrong. Granny was paying close attention. Was the sugar bowl blue as well, dearie? She said. Was it part of a set with the milk jug? I stared at her in admiration. No, I said. I looked directly at Inspector Locke to deliver what suddenly felt like very important information. The sugar bowl was imprinted with the crest of the Royal Victoria Hotel. So then there's a break in the story. It's not the end of a chapter, but there's a break. I believe my destiny is decided. Hector's green eyes shone, and there was a shell pink hue to his pale cheeks. His grin stretched in true delight. I like very much this occupation of knowing other people's business. The job of a policeman is for me an excellent match. Not if it means you have to grow a nasty great bramble bush on your face. I was thinking of the inspector's shaggy upper lip and jaws, only slightly better than a furry crawling caterpillar like Mr. Roddy Fusswell's. I don't know that French word. M-A-I-S. You're going to have to help me, Grace. M-A-I-S. Non. My mustache will be elegant, sleek, with ends to here, fine and pointed. Hector rubbed his fingertips together close to his earlobes, as if his mustache would be as grand as that of a circus ringmaster. Ugh, I was quite firm. The asking of questions that no polite person may ask, said Hector, unwrapping the thoughts of the suspect, seeking always the solution to a puzzle. Is this not a wonderful endeavor? I want to hear about what Charlotte and the policeman said, I said. What happened? I had already described my 42 minutes with Inspector Locke. Now it was his turn. Hector had been miserable, desolate, when told to leave the library. Excluded from the heat of the fire, he said. But the policeman's infatuation with Miss Graves, this is lucky for me, no? Go on, tell. Hector had been sitting on the hallway settee, nursing his wounded spirit and wondering how he should go about informing Miss Graves that she was desired for questioning. He hoped that a servant would pass through the hallway, for where in a big, strange house should he even begin to look? Happily, Charlotte herself appeared from upstairs and tapped on the library door. Constable Beck, face aflame, informed her that he had official questions to ask, and would she please step into the dining room. Hector used the moment while the young officer gained approval from the inspector to slip in ahead of them and hide underneath the dining table. Oh, just as I would have done, I told him. That's one of the best hiding spots. When Papa was alive, my parents had fancy dinners with lots of people wearing evening clothes. The champagne made them terribly chatty. It was an excellent game. Now it's only ever family, and I already know their secrets. Tony's paw nails clicked on the wooden floor as he padded over from his spot in a shaft of sunlight. He made a small, polite yip. We need to take Tony outside, I said. Better that you make your report out there. I dropped my voice to a whisper. Granny Jane says that servants listen to everything. I ushered Hector along the hallway to the kitchen, with Tony skittering at our heels. Hello, Mrs. Corner. I patted Cook on the arm as we crossed to the garden door. This is my friend Hector. He's the extra for tea. Oh, I hope you like fruit pie, laddie, said Mrs. Corner. As much as Miss Aggie does? Oui, madame. Hector performed a quick bow, managing not to trip over Tony. I'm going to show you my favorite place. I dragged him past the grove of pear trees to a spot at the edge of the little wood that separated our property from the Eversham villa next door. See? Groveland was so far above the town that when winter came and the trees were bare, we could see the sea. Today, though, the warm yellow of a few remaining October leaves still blocked the view, casting dappled shadows on a wooden bench and the row of painted gravestones at our feet. What is this? Said Hector, peering. Mummy would say it's a symptom of my morbid preoccupation, but really it's perfectly genteel. This one is for Marigold, my canary. When she was my first pet, when I was 6. These are all the gravestones that are out in the graveyard. Then Kiki here, and Tom Tom. They were minor birds. That's why I put the colored stripes across the headstones. Ooh, most thoughtful, said Hector, admirably unperturbed. And this? Oh, that's just a squirrel, I said. He wasn't a pet, but I named him Squiffy to make the tombstone more personal. And the big one here was the kitchen cat named Ivy. That's why I've painted leaves, you see. When Ivy died, I played the mandolin at her funeral. It was ever so doleful and reverent. Cook cried and cried. We never got another cat, so we got mice instead, like everywhere else in Torquay. You make a pleasant rest for the animals, said Hector, and a good place to discuss death. Let's sit, I said, while you tell me everything. Hector brushed the bench with his hand and checked his palm to see that nothing had stuck. He sat carefully, knees and ankles touching. I supposed it was best not to tease him for something so inconsequential as being a fuss bucket, because he was being all prim and proper while they're just sitting outside in the grass. Not while there was a murderer on the loose. Well, I said. Tony was snuffling in a patch of tall grass overlooked by Leonard's mowing. Hector picked up the story. I'm under the table, twisted into a knot like a serpent in a basket, he said. And what did you hear? The policeman, he asks many questions. Who is standing where? How does the body lie? Can she name anything out of position? Miss Graves, she answers most efficiently. She tells the same details that you tell to me already. Tony yipped twice, excited by something he'd found near the tree. Shh, Tony, I said. Go on, Hector. However, said Hector, there is one curious item. Constable Beck is particularly interested in the piece of paper. What piece of paper? You do not mention such a thing in your description of the murder scene? So I try very much to hear, but my limbs are becoming most cramped. A missing paper is indicated because of the scrap? What scrap? Did you find out what it matters? A tiny scrap of paper is squeezed between the thumb and the forefinger of the deceased, discovered by Dr. Chase during his examination. Hector's eyes narrowed. You do not know of this? Ah, that's what Inspector Locke had been prodding me to remember. Think very carefully, he'd said. Was the victim holding anything in her hand? Something white, perhaps? How irritating not to have seen it. Nothing visible was clutched in the corpse's hand. It must have been very small. The only paper in the room that I knew about... Hold on. Were the pages of my poetry notebook sitting on top of the piano. Your nursemaid also reports no evidence of a piece of a paper or a scrap, said Hector. After this, the interview between Constable Beck and Miss Graves becomes what I believe you English call gooey. The words of inquiry turn to murmurings of romance. This is when I put my fingers into my ears and I cease to listen. Romance? Really? Plain and earnest, Charlotte? I could not think of a less gooey person. They do nothing improper, I assure you, said Hector. Simply the whisperings of lovebirds. He twirled his imaginary mustache. They only met a week ago, I said. It's rather saucy of Charlotte to be whispering like a lovebird, don't you think? Tony yapped and began to paw furiously at something amongst the weeds. What have you got there, Tony? I got up to look. Something nasty, I expect. Since you're so excited. A rabbit lay dead. Its stiff fur ruffled and its little head torn open, a trickle of blood seeping from a gray puddle of muck. Yuck, right? It's the end of chapter 6. They found a dead rabbit. All right, see you next time. Okay, chapter 7. A sleight of hand. Okay, it shows the tombstones. Squiffy and Marigold. I've always thought my brain was pink. I leaned over to get a better look at the earthly remains. Are rabbits different from people? No, said Hector. I am a devoted student on the topic of the human brain. For something so intriguing, it is notably a dull gray in color, as you can see. Ugh, Tony, no. I caught the dog's collar and tugged him away from his prize. Let the poor bunny rest in peace. I pulled up fistfuls of grass and sprinkled them over the mutilated carcass. Mrs. Eversham's feet appeared in my mind. Losing one's brains is undignified enough, I said, let alone being mauled by a frenzied terrier. Not that a rabbit has much to lose with a brain the size of a plum. Au contraire, said Hector. A rabbit is a creature of much character, most playful and clever. Clever? It took a bit of strength to wrestle Tony along the path away from the corpse. Inside the brain, Hector tapped his forehead, are billions of nerves dancing together, telling to each other many messages, like we just read about in Magic School Bus, right? This friction is the essence of how we think. And a rabbit has an abundance of friction amongst its brain cells, I said. Not so much as humans, said Hector, but for its size, yes. Alas, the size makes him prey to nearly every other animal, including us. He is born expecting to die. Aren't we all? Tony raced ahead, circled back, and bounded onward again. Look, there's Leonard. I waved at the garden boy. He looked up from his digging and pushed back his cap, freeing a curl over his eyebrows. Miss Aggie, he said, and glanced sideways at Hector. This is my friend, Hector Perot, I said. He's staying for tea. Hector, this is Leonard. He works here in the garden. Leonard nodded at Hector, and Hector nodded back. We found a dead rabbit, I pointed. Tony did, actually. Its brain is... I wiggled my fingers beside my head. leaking out. Ooh, maybe a fox got him, said Leonard. And we didn't know him. We needn't hold a funeral, I said. But would you mind digging a hole near the others? I looked toward the leafy awning of the beech tree protecting the creatures buried below. Yes, miss, he said. I'll do that before dark. Thank you, Leonard. I'll think of a name and make him a stone later. Yes, miss. He shifted the shovel to his other hand. I was wondering, is there trouble? I saw the police wagon. Oh, there's been a murder! It was thrilling being the one to tell such news before anyone else. In the mermaid room, where you brought the flowers last night? I was meant to be having my Saturday lesson, you see, and I found the body. Leonard stared. Perhaps I shouldn't sound so eager. I took a breath. That's why the police came to interview me and Charlotte. I was practically a witness to a monstrous crime. I could feel Hector fidgeting next to me. This is perhaps not an item to be trumpeted, he said. If indeed it is murder, there is still a murderer to be found. Of course it's murder. Do you think she poisoned herself? I'm only telling Leonard. I said, not advertising in the Torquay Voice. Goodness, that means I've found 2 dead bodies in one day. First Mrs. Eversham and now the poor rabbit. Leonard gazed at me with those enormous brown eyes. Mrs. Eversham, miss? She's dead? Oh, dead as dead, I said. As dead as the rabbit in the grass. As dead as a coffin nail. As dead as Papa. Leonard looked faintly perturbed, so I allowed the corpse to rest and turned instead to the police. They asked a lot of questions, I told him. I had to demonstrate the position of the body, and I'm sure to think of more clues later. The police seemed a bit plodding, to be honest. But goodness, you were there this morning as well, Leonard. Did you see anything suspicious when you collected the bouquets? Thank you, by the way, for hauling them back to Croveland. It's like having spring in the drawing room. Nice for us that Miss Mary Ann didn't want to keep them. Leonard was fidgeting and fiddling with the brim of his cap. I nipped in and out quick as I could, he said. The stairwell was plugged up like an old pipe, with the Vickers men shifting those whopping crates. That bossy chap from the hotel packed up his tea things as if they were as precious as the king's china, and there I was doing my best with the vases. Did you see Mrs. Eversham? And a proper snit with your teacher she was. He looked at the ground, kicking a lot of dirt off the path. Have you thought of something? I said. Oh, it's nothing. Leonard pulled his cap off and put it back on at a new angle over his brow. Nothing can be considered nothing, I said. She's dead. I'll tell you who I don't think much of, said Leonard. Mr. Fusswell. He nearly stepped on me more than once, but never actually went anywhere. Just took his time, stacking teacups one by one. He looked from my face to Hector's and back again. You want to steer right clear of it, he said, quite urgently. No reason to get mixed up in anything so shockingly macabre, I said. So horrifically gruesome, so morbid and grisly? Leonard didn't smile as I'd hoped he would. Perhaps he'd cheer up if I asked for his specialty. Will you do a trick for us, Leonard? Hector will be so baffled. Please? Aw, miss. He does conjuring, I told Hector. Watch. Leonard shuffled his boots. I haven't got a sixpence. I hadn't got one either, my pocket money being minded in Charlotte's pocket. But how about I have a look around, eh? Leonard laid down the shovel and pulled his trouser pocket inside out to show how empty it was. This was part of the trick. Oh dear, I said, nothing there. Leonard examined the ground for a moment as if he might spot a coin in the grass. He took his cap off and peered at its lining. Hold on, wait for the jet. Come on, jet. Then, aha! His fingers nimbly plucked a sixpence from behind Hector's left ear. He held it up with a victorious grin. I laughed and clapped my hands. Ooh, this is much skill, said Hector. Do another, I cried. I believe, said Hector, that your policemen are departing. Indeed, the horses were tossing their heads and clopping away from the house. Goodbye, Leonard. I set off across the spiky yellowing grass at nearly a gallop, with Hector stumbling along behind. Can we not travel along the path? He called. The dirt on my shoes is... I kept running. Dirty, he finished. I've thought of something, I said over my shoulder. I must tell the inspector. But the police horses had picked up speed. They were around the curve and gone before we'd reached the drive. My stockings drooped after running. That's like socks. I pulled them straight. Why are you panting like an old dog? I asked Hector. I have no practice in scampering through the nature. He plucked stray blades of grass from his trousers. I wonder if your thought is similar to my thought. Here it is. There's a gnat. I said, I do not believe Miss Mary Ann to be a murderess. I love her. I will vouch for her goodness, though I suppose that even heinous villains have friends who would swear to their innocence. But also, she lives in the same house with the victim. If she were going to kill her sister-in-law, would it not be simpler to do so at home? Most certainly, said Hector. She could have mixed poison with cocoa and brought it to her in bed. Or she might have left a bucket on the cellar steps and let her tumble to the bottom to break her neck. Or stabbed her with a paring knife and said it was a cooking accident. Or tampered with her medicine if she took any. I trailed off. Hector's eyebrows had lifted up to his hairline. So many resourceful suggestions. I shall hope not to displease you, he grinned. But is it Miss Mary Ann who brews the tea? I expect so. It is her pantry. Not an answer in her favor. Was the poison in the teapot or in the sugar bowl, do you suppose? A question we must strive to answer, said Hector. Either way, at first glance, Miss Mary Ann is the most suspicious character. Then we've got to look deeper, I said. We must activate the friction in our brains to a frenzy. The inspector does not know Miss Mary Ann as I do, and will not try so hard. For a moment, let us say that she is not the killer we are seeking, said Hector. She does not make a perfect accident happen in her own. She does not imagine that vanquishing her nasty relative will make life better. Well, she did do that, I said, but everyone else did too, especially Rose, and even... A smirking face came to mind. Even Mr. Roddy Fusswell. It is not Miss Mary Ann who performs the murder, said Hector. It means that someone else arranges for Mrs. Irma Eversham to drink the poison. Yes? The poison must have been in the sugar bowl, I said. That's why the inspector was so interested when I told him about the crest. The sugar bowl was only in the mermaid room because of Mr. Roddy Fusswell. That makes him awfully suspicious, don't you think? More suspicious even than Miss Mary Ann. However the poison is administered, said Hector gravely, there is the important matter of why does it happen in the mermaid room? Why not at home with the cocoa? Does somebody know that Mrs. Eversham will be present to drink the tea on this particular Saturday? My heart turned upside down inside my chest. Mrs. Eversham had never visited before. Mr. Dillon said so, remember? No one could have known ahead of time. That means that either the killer saw her arrive or... Tony whined at my feet. A gust of wind brought a spatter of rain. Hector and I had come up with the same idea. This was precisely what I had wished to suggest to Inspector Locke. Miss Mary Ann was the one who was always there, alone, except during lessons, I said. Was it Miss Mary Ann who was meant to drink the poison? And that is the end of chapter 7. Just in time for the jet to come through.